Hello, and welcome to my second video about New York City's community preference policies. In case you missed the first video, let's do a quick recap. So New York City is building new affordable units, and those units are offered on its webpage by lottery. Now, it's not a completely random lottery because actually half of the units in each building are set aside for people who live in the community district where the building is built. So this is called the community preference policy, and this is exactly what the lawsuit is challenging because the plaintiffs are claiming that this policy perpetuates existing patterns of segregation in the city. Now, to argue this case, both sides are doing some data analysis, right? Specifically, they're analyzing a data set of over 10,000 units that were allocated across a 7-year span. In part one of my video, I took a look at the plaintiff's case and their beverage. Today, I'm going to be looking at the city's defense, which was conducted by Bernard Siskin. Let's very briefly recap my critique of Beveridge's report. So in my last video, I did a fairly detailed analysis of what he was showing and not showing in each table. But for this video, all you need to know is the following, which is a very simple point, that for any policy, if you want to understand the effect of that policy, you should compare what happened with the policy to what happened without it. And to be frank, Beveridge doesn't do this. If we look at the 8 main tables in his report, half of them have nothing to do with the actual outcomes. They're just analyzing the application data. And as a result, the data in those tables would actually be exactly the same regardless of what policy was used to allocate the units. The other half of the tables do incorporate outcomes, but he makes no attempt to estimate a counterfactual of what would have happened with a different policy in place. And so that makes it very, very difficult to interpret the numbers in those tables and to really understand what was the effect of the policy. So that's my critique of Beveridge's report. If I had to similarly summarize my critique of Siskin's report, I would say, well, he does actually attempt to compare outcomes with and without the policy, which is great, but he doesn't really choose the right outcomes to compare. I also have some questions about his methods for estimating what would have happened without the policy. I'm not going to go too deep into those in this video. So Siskin presents 3 main analyses, and I'm just going to tackle them one by one. His first analysis is actually totally irrelevant to the case, right? He says the city's affordable housing overwhelmingly serves people of color, even in majority white areas. And I believe that that's true, but it really has nothing to do with the effect of the community preference policy. So I'm just going to move on past this point. Okay. His second point does have to do with the effect of the community preference policy. Specifically, he uses simulations to argue that the community preference policy has very little impact on the race of the awardees, the people who are given housing, when you aggregate at the city level. His estimate of the number of white applicants who would be awarded a unit with the policy in effect is 883. If the policy were not in effect, that would go down to 851. And so it concludes basically, there's just not a very large effect in the race of awardees. So setting aside for a second how he ran the simulations, I think the most important thing about this table is that he chooses to do the analysis citywide. And he argues that this is the right way to do it because the policy applies citywide. Now, I don't think this is a crazy position to hold, but one important thing to note is that if you're just analyzing at a citywide level, you're really not able to address the claim that this community preference policy promotes segregation. And it's obvious that there are a lot of blatantly illegal policies that wouldn't affect these numbers, the total number of white, African-American, Hispanic, and Asian applicants to be housed, but would clearly promote segregation, right? For example, you could say, okay, in this borough, we're only going to place African-Americans. In this borough, we're only going to place white and Asians. And maybe that wouldn't affect the total numbers, but it would very clearly be promoting segregation. So just the fact that the community preference policy doesn't have a big impact in this table doesn't necessarily suggest that the plaintiff's case is wrong. Siskin also conducts a comparison of segregation with and without this policy. But his chosen measure of segregation is a citywide dissimilarity index. And so he concludes that the policy had almost no impact on segregation, but he points out actually that even if you tried to explicitly exclude or favor one group, you couldn't really move the needle on this index. And that's just because the number of housing units that are being allocated through these lotteries is very small relative to the city's entire housing stock. So this also seems like an extremely weak argument, because basically, even if you had a policy that explicitly excluded one racial group from these units, it wouldn't really move the needle on this citywide dissimilarity index. So that's not really a very good argument. Siskin's third point is a little bit more subtle. And he's saying that instead of looking at who was awarded housing, we should actually look at who was considered for housing. So to be awarded, you need to be considered, meaning processed by the developer, but you also need to be found eligible, and you need to remain interested and actually accept the offer that you receive. And so he's saying the community preference policy affects who's considered, who's processed. It doesn't directly affect who's eligible or interested. And so really we should be focusing on its effect on who gets considered. And I think this is a reasonable argument. I'm sympathetic to it. The challenge is that we don't really have the data to observe this, right? We don't observe who was actually considered. Some households that in the data look like they might not be eligible actually were considered. And we know that because they were actually awarded, right? So 8.5% of the units in the data set were awarded to families that didn't appear to be eligible. And of course, if we don't even know who was considered under the current policy, it's much more difficult to know who would have been considered under an alternative without community preference. Now, Siskin argues that we can use the data to basically determine who was considered. And that's because we do have information about who was eligible for community preference, which apartment types each applicant was eligible for, who was actually awarded a unit, and everyone's lottery number. The idea is that if we see an apartment that I was eligible for that went to someone who had a worse lottery number than I did, it must have been that I was considered and for one reason or another, not housed. Either I wasn't eligible or I wasn't actually interested and didn't follow up. So this sounds reasonable, but when you actually look at the conclusions, he seems to be getting some, what I would argue, unreasonable conclusions. Here's what he finds. He finds that 34% of all applicants are considered on average, which if you know anything about New York City's affordable housing might seem surprisingly high. Because the narrative is always, oh, it's very, very difficult to get these apartments. But he's actually saying over a third of the applicants to any building are actually considered. However, he also concludes that only 1% of the applicants who are considered are eventually awarded housing, meaning that they're both eligible and interested. Now, despite this finding, it's interesting to note that in his simulations, he assumes that everyone who is considered will eventually be awarded. So that's an interesting discrepancy. But setting that aside for a minute, I just don't believe these numbers. I don't believe that 1/3 of applicants are considered, but only 1% of those are actually interested. So in my next video, I'm going to solve that mystery. I'm going to give you my explanation for why he would reach the conclusion that 1/3 of applicants are considered on average, which seems to fly in the face of common sense and existing narratives. And a key feature that will help me unlock this puzzle is the fact that units in a building are actually often offered at different income levels. So for example, if we take this 425 Grand Concourse apartments, we see that even among 1-bedroom units, there are some units that are offered to people who earn 30% of the area median income, 9 such units. In other words, these are offered to households making between $19,000 and $32,000. There are some other 1-bedroom units in the same apartment that are offered to people making 130% of area median income. In other words, between $70,000 and $140,000. So this feature is not something that is mentioned in either of the expert analyses that I've gone through so far. And in my next video, I'll explain why I think it's important and how it relates to these suspiciously high considered rates that Siskin reports.